I had planned this camping trip for weeks. It was summer 2017, and I was visiting my hometown in Colorado to spend some time with my family. My dad, Mike, was in his late 60s and had been battling liver disease for a while. He needed a transplant soon, but despite his declining health, he still had that spark in his eyes. My youngest brother, Tyler, was 22 at the time, full of energy and always ready to help. We had never gone camping as just the three of us, and I thought it would be a meaningful way to reconnect. We settled on a nearby spot in the San Juan Mountains, not far from Durango. It was car camping, simple, close to civilization, and manageable given Dad's health. We loaded the car with tents, sleeping bags, a cooler full of food, and enough gear to make the weekend comfortable. The drive up the winding mountain road was peaceful, the kind of ride where you roll the windows down and let the fresh pine air fill your lungs. By late afternoon, we reached a clearing nestled by a small creek. The spot was perfect. Tall aspens surrounded us, their leaves whispering in the wind. A faint trail led down to the water, where smooth stones lined the bank. I could tell Dad was struggling a bit. His steps were slower, his breathing heavier, but he didn't complain. He never did. We set up camp quickly. Tyler and I pitched the tent while Dad sorted out the chairs and started a fire. By sunset, the flames were crackling, casting a warm glow over us. Dinner was simple but delicious: hot dogs roasted over the fire, a side of baked beans, and s'mores for dessert. The conversation flowed easily. We laughed about old family stories, Tyler's college antics, and the trips we used to take when we were kids. As the stars came out, we sat in comfortable silence, just listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, the creek gurgled softly, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded us we weren't alone out here. It felt like a moment frozen in time. Just us, the fire, and the wild. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee brewing. Tyler was already up, tending to the fire. Dad was moving slowly, rubbing his temples like he had a mild headache. "I'll be back," he muttered, heading toward the bushes to relieve himself. What happened next unfolded in slow motion. I looked up just in time to see him stumble. At first, I thought he had tripped, but then he fell forward, hard. His body toppled over the edge of a small embankment, tumbling down a jagged slope of boulders into a dry creek bed. "Dad!" I shouted, bolting upright. Tyler was already ahead of me, sprinting down the slope. When we reached him, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. Dad was lying face down, groaning softly. His nose was bleeding, bent at an awkward angle, and a gash ran across his forehead. Blood smeared his cheek and dripped onto the rocks below. The top layer of skin on his right hand had peeled back, degloved, exposing raw flesh underneath. "Dad, don't move," I said, my voice shaky but firm. Tyler and I carefully rolled him onto his back. He winced, his eyes fluttering open. "I'm okay," he muttered weakly, though it was obvious he wasn't. His words were slurred, his pupils unfocused. I went into autopilot. Years of watching medical dramas kicked in, though I knew this was no TV show. "Tyler, grab the tarp from under the tent," I said. "We need to get him in the car." Tyler didn't hesitate. He sprinted back to camp while I stayed with Dad, trying to clean him up as best I could. I used my water bottle to rinse the dirt from his wounds and pressed a clean bandana to his forehead to stop the bleeding. His skin felt cold and clammy under my hands. Tyler returned with the tarp, and we managed to half-drag, half-carry Dad up the embankment. Every step felt agonizingly slow, but we finally got him into the back seat of Tyler's car. I spread the tarp over the seat to keep the blood from soaking in. "Take him to the hospital," I told Tyler. "I'll stay and pack up the camp." Tyler hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. "Are you sure?" "Yes, go now. Drive carefully." As they sped off down the dirt road, I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty clearing. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. I took a deep breath and turned back to the campsite. Packing up alone was surreal. The fire pit still smelled of last night's embers, and the morning sun dappled the ground through the trees. It should have been peaceful, but the weight of what had just happened hung over me. As I rolled up the sleeping bags and folded the tent, my mind raced. Was Dad going to be okay? How had he fallen like that? He wasn't drunk. Was he? No, he couldn't be. He'd been so careful ever since his diagnosis. But a nagging doubt lingered in the back of my mind. By the time I finished packing, my hands were shaking. I sat down on a log by the fire pit, staring at the charred wood. It hit me then like a punch to the gut. Dad wasn't invincible. The man who had once carried me on his shoulders, who had taught me how to fish and build a campfire, was now fragile, breakable. I drove down the mountain slowly, my thoughts a blur. When I reached the hospital, I found Tyler pacing in the waiting room. "He's stable," Tyler said as soon as he saw me, "but there's something else." The doctor had run some tests and found Dad's blood alcohol content was alarmingly high, around 0.2%. At 7 a.m., my stomach dropped. I felt a wave of anger, confusion, and sadness all at once. Dad had been drinking. After everything he'd been through, I didn't know whether to yell or cry. When we finally saw him, he looked small and defeated in the hospital bed. His face was swollen, his hand bandaged, but his eyes were clear. He admitted to us that he'd been drinking in secret, battling depression and hopelessness over his illness. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a reason. The next few weeks were hard. Dad opened up to his friends and family about his struggles, and with their support, he made a choice to turn his life around. He quit drinking entirely, joined a support group, and focused on his health. A year later, he got the transplant. Recovery was slow, but he pulled through. This past winter, we went camping again, just the three of us. Same mountains, same crisp air, but this time, no emergencies. We sat around the fire, talking and laughing, grateful for the second chance. That first trip will always haunt me, but it also taught me something. Life is fragile, but it's also resilient. And sometimes the hardest days can lead to the most meaningful changes. It was the summer of 2021, and we were on the tail end of a 2-week camping trip that had taken us all across the Southwest. We'd covered so many miles, and now we were deep into the mountains of southern Colorado. Our final stop was a remote national forest campground near Durango, a quiet place far from any city lights, tucked into the woods, surrounded by towering pine trees. It had been an exhausting but beautiful journey, but there was something about this last campsite that felt different. We had arrived after dark, the sun just dipping behind the jagged mountain peaks. It was already too late to get a good look at the surrounding landscape, but I could tell the place was secluded, quiet. My husband, Mark, and I set up camp with the kids, our son, Luke, and our 2 daughters, Emma and Sophie, while the darkness crept in. As soon as we were done, we all huddled into the tent to sleep. The air was crisp, and the usual sounds of the forest, wind rustling through the branches, distant calls of birds, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, had a calming effect. Everything felt peaceful, at least for a while. We all settled in, the kids snuggling into their sleeping bags, and Mark and I lying beside them, exhausted from the day's hike. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I lay there in the dark. At first, I thought it was just the remoteness of the area playing tricks on me. Then, in the silence, I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound from outside the tent, accompanied by the flicker of a flashlight. The beam of light danced across the tense fabric, casting odd, elongated shadows. I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath boots, the kind of noise you only make when you're trying to be quiet but failing. Mark stirred beside me. I could feel his body tense up, his breath quickening. He didn't say anything, but I knew he'd heard it too. We both lay there, pretending to be asleep, unsure of what to do. My mind raced with questions. Who was out there? Why were they walking around our tent in the middle of the night? It wasn't like a park ranger or someone making rounds. This felt different, intentional even. The light lingered near our tent for what seemed like an eternity. My heart thudded in my chest, the pounding loud in my ears. I held my breath, trying to listen to any sounds that could tell me what was happening. There was something unsettling about the way the light came and went. It wasn't a casual passing. It was like whoever it was deliberately scanning the area, as if looking for something or someone. Then, after a few moments, the light disappeared. I strained my ears, listening intently for any sign of movement. My thoughts raced. Should we get up? Should we call the sheriff? But then, something about the situation told me to stay still, to wait. It wasn't the time to react. There was an odd, unsettling calmness in me. The kind of feeling you get when you sense that if you do the wrong thing, everything could spiral out of control. We stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, and eventually the flashlight's beam faded away. The footsteps retreated, leaving nothing but the eerie quiet of the night. My mind couldn't fully grasp what had just happened, but I knew we were not alone. Mark, still tense, didn't move for what felt like hours. When we finally did fall into a restless sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, the sun was already high in the sky when we finally woke up. The kids were already out of their sleeping bags, excitedly talking about breakfast. But for Mark and me, the events of the night lingered heavily in our minds. We didn't say much, just exchanged looks that said it all. We hadn't imagined it. Someone had definitely been walking around our tent. As we began to pack up, I noticed that the campground was eerily quiet. It wasn't just the usual morning calm. There was something off. As we broke down the campsite and loaded the car, I saw a few other campers walking by, but no one seemed particularly disturbed. Yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened that we didn't fully understand. It wasn't until much later that we learned the full story. After packing up and heading out for a scenic drive through the mountains, we stopped by a local diner for breakfast. The waitress, who was friendly and chatty, told us about some of the goings-on in the area. "You folks camping in Durango last night?" she asked, smiling politely. "Some crazy stuff went down there. Sheriff was out all night." That's when she told us about the domestic dispute that had occurred the night before, not far from our campsite. A man had been fighting with his girlfriend, and it had escalated into something violent. The authorities had been called, but by the time they arrived, the man had fled the scene. The sheriff had been out looking for him, combing through the area in the middle of the night, and it turned out the flashlight we saw shining through our tent was none other than the sheriff himself, looking for the suspect. We were stunned. I had been right all along. Our intuition had kept us from reacting. If we'd decided to burst out of the tent, we would have confronted an armed sheriff who was no doubt on high alert. In that moment, had we made the wrong choice, everything could have gone wrong. We could have found ourselves in the middle of a terrifying situation with no idea what we were dealing with. The sheriff didn't stop to check on us, though. He just continued his search, his flashlight moving on. Later, we found out that the man involved in the dispute had parked his truck near our campsite in the middle of the night, probably trying to make a quick getaway. The sheriff had been searching for him when he passed by our tent. The suspect had fled on foot, and the sheriff had no idea we were in that exact spot at that exact time. We had been mere inches away from potentially walking right into a high-stress situation, and by some strange twist of fate, we had managed to avoid it. The whole thing left me shaken. As we packed up and moved to our next stop, I couldn't help but think about how close we had come to being involved in something far worse than just a tense, sleepless night. There were so many little choices, so many tiny moments where one wrong move could have changed everything. For the rest of the trip, I kept a sharp eye out at every campsite, always listening, always looking over my shoulder. It was a reminder of how unpredictable life can be. How, sometimes, you don't even realize you're on the edge of danger until it's almost too late. That experience stayed with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the world, especially in the quiet, remote places, could turn dark in an instant. We never saw the sheriff again, and we never learned what happened to the man from the domestic dispute. But that night, that strange, eerie moment when the flashlight shone through our tent, stayed with me. It was a lesson in the importance of intuition, of staying calm when everything inside you screams to run. And, most of all, it was a reminder that sometimes the scariest things don't come with loud sounds or warning signs. They come in the quietest of moments when you least expect them. It was the summer of 2017, and I was part of a Boy Scout troop from Central Illinois. We'd been planning this trip for months, and now, standing in the parking lot of the Glacier Bay National Park Visitor Center in Alaska, it felt unreal. We had taken the train across the country, then hitchhiked to the nearest point we could get to. This was supposed to be the culmination of everything we'd been training for. A high-adventure trip, backpacking through the wilderness of Alaska. It was a big deal for us. We'd arrived at the park just before noon, hoping to get all the paperwork sorted out, pick up our permits, and get our gear checked. There were a few other groups milling around, some local tourists, some other backpacking groups. It wasn't crowded, but it was busy enough to keep everyone occupied. I was with my friends, Jake and Sam, and we were joking around, getting ready for the hike that would take us deep into the park. It wasn't long before we noticed a couple of other scouts, older than us, getting ready to head into the office. They were a year or two ahead, looking all serious in their uniforms, their heavy packs already strapped to their backs. Then, out of nowhere, there was a screech of tires followed by a loud, sickening thud. A truck had slammed into a motorcycle right at the entrance to the visitor center. The noise hit us like a punch, and my heart immediately jumped into my throat. I've never heard anything like it. The crash wasn't some distant rumble. It was right there, right in front of us. People screamed. The sound of the collision echoed, and I froze for a second. But the older boys, Aaron, Mike, and Daniel, they didn't freeze. They were already on the move before anyone else could even process what happened. I didn't think. I just ran after them, hoping to help in any way I could. The truck was already stopped, its front end crumpled, the hood bent up and smoldering. The motorcycle had been thrown clear off the road, and the couple who had been riding it were sprawled out on the gravel. The woman, unconscious and bleeding from her head, lay closest to the road, her limbs twisted unnaturally. The man, somehow still conscious, was groaning, but he couldn't move. His face was pale, and blood was oozing from a deep gash on his leg. I didn't even think about fear. We were trained in first aid and emergency response, but this was different. This wasn't some scenario we had simulated in class. This was real. Aaron, the oldest of the boys, was already kneeling by the woman, checking for a pulse. "She's alive," he muttered under his breath, his voice tight, calm despite the chaos. He checked her head and neck for signs of serious injury. Then, without a word, he looked up at Mike and nodded. Mike was the one who took charge of the man. He checked his pulse, his breathing, and started to move his legs carefully. The guy was conscious, but he was in obvious pain, unable to move much. There was a lot of blood, too much blood, His right leg had been badly injured, maybe broken, and he kept trying to hold on to his girlfriend, who was still out cold. Daniel was the one who immediately pulled out the first aid kit from his backpack. He didn't waste any time. He started working on the man's leg, applying pressure to slow the bleeding, all while giving instructions to me and Sam, telling us where to place our hands. We worked quickly, doing everything we could to stabilize them while Aaron kept an eye on the woman. I remember the sirens in the distance, faint at first, but slowly growing louder. I don't know how long it took for the ambulance to arrive, but it felt like an eternity. In reality, it was probably closer to 30 minutes, maybe an hour, but it felt longer, like time had stretched and bent in ways I couldn't understand. The heat from the sun beat down on us, and I kept wiping the sweat from my forehead, but it didn't matter. The couple's lives were hanging by a thread. We were the only ones there, and if we hadn't acted as quickly as we did, I know they wouldn't have made it. Finally, the ambulance arrived, and the EMTs rushed out with their equipment. They immediately took over, and we all stood off to the side, exhausted but relieved. The woman was still unconscious when they loaded her onto a stretcher, but they said she was stable. The man was in worse shape. They airlifted him out shortly after, the helicopter arriving to take him to the nearest trauma center. We stood there for a few minutes after everything was done, watching as the helicopter took off, and the sounds of the crash scene slowly faded away. For a while, there wasn't much to say. I guess none of us had really thought about what we had just done until it was over. A few days later, we packed up our gear and set off on our backpacking adventure. The first few miles of the trail felt like the perfect escape from everything that had happened. It was peaceful and quiet, with nothing but the sounds of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. There was a certain weight that had settled on all of us, though, and we could all feel it. We had just been through something intense. Over the next week, we hiked through some of the most beautiful terrain I've ever seen. Glaciers, towering mountains, crystal clear rivers. Every night we camped under the stars, the air so crisp you could almost taste it. But even in the silence of the wild, I couldn't forget about the accident. It kept creeping into my thoughts, especially when we were alone, far from any help. Then, as we returned to the visitor center at the end of our trip, something unexpected happened. We were all tired, sore, and ready to head home. We hadn't thought about the accident since we left, but as we walked back toward the office, I saw them, the couple. They were standing by the same spot where the crash had happened, the woman holding the man's arm. He was still limping a little, but they both looked much better. I didn't recognize them at first, but then I saw the way they were looking at us, with something more than gratitude in their eyes. They stepped forward, and I realized they had come to thank us. We didn't need the thanks, of course. That wasn't why we did it. But the look in their eyes, it made everything worth it. The long hours of hiking, the time spent in the wilderness, all of it. It made me realize how fragile life really is. The couple told us they'd never forget what we'd done for them. They said that if we hadn't shown up when we did, they wouldn't be standing there, talking to us. I guess that was the thing about our adventure. We went into that wilderness to challenge ourselves, to test our limits. But we also came back with something more, something deeper. We came back with the knowledge that sometimes you're called to do something that goes beyond what you thought you were capable of. And when that moment comes, you don't hesitate. As we waved goodbye and left the park, I couldn't help but think about how our lives had all changed in just a few short days. Our adventure had been about more than just hiking. It had been about making a difference in a moment when it mattered most. That night, as we sat on the train heading back home, I could still see their faces in my mind, the look of relief, the tears in their eyes. And I knew that, no matter where we went or what we did, we had made a real difference. That's the kind of thing you can't forget. It was late in the afternoon when I met up with my gym partner, Sergeant Ray, for a camping trip. Ray was 75 years old, but still had the energy of someone much younger. He'd been camping for decades and had more stories of surviving the wilderness than I could count. He invited me to spend the weekend with him in the woods, saying it would be a good break from the usual. He had all the old school gear, nothing fancy, just solid stuff that looked like it had been through a lot, and a map of the area that was older than I was. We arrived at the campsite around sunset. The sky was painted with orange and purple as the sun dipped below the trees. The air was fresh, and a gentle breeze moved through the tall pines around us. We got to work setting up the camp, and I could tell Ray had done this 100 times before. He got his tent up quickly, while I fumbled with mine. But in no time, the campfire was crackling, and we were sitting around it, staring into the flames. After a while, Ray got up to check on the food cooking over the fire. I stayed by the fire, watching the woods get darker. It was quiet, too quiet. There were no bugs chirping, no birds calling, just silence. I've always thought it was weird when the woods were that still. Around midnight, the temperature dropped fast. I zipped my jacket up tighter and shifted in my seat by the fire, starting to feel uneasy. At first, I thought it was just the cold, but then it felt like someone was watching me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the dark woods making me paranoid. Ray came back to the campfire, his face a little tense. He didn't say much, just stared into the trees around us. "I don't like this," he said, but his voice didn't sound scared, just strange, like he was trying to figure something out. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something didn't feel right. We had a flashlight, but we didn't use it much. The light from the fire gave us enough to see what was around us. But as I looked into the woods, beyond the circle of light, I felt it. Something was out there. The air felt different, heavier. Then I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves. It wasn't an animal. The sound was too slow, too controlled. Ray noticed it too. He stiffened, his eyes scanning the trees, but he didn't move. We sat in silence, listening to the stillness again. Then I heard it, another snap of a twig, this time closer. My heart skipped. I whipped around, but saw nothing. Ray stood up, grabbing a metal rod from the ground. He wasn't panicking, but there was no mistaking the alertness in his movements. I stood up too, my breath quickening, waiting. Another snap, closer now. But it wasn't an animal. Animals don't make noises like that. My gut told me to run, but Ray raised his hand, telling me to stay quiet and still. Without saying anything else, he started walking towards the sound, moving slow, like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. I followed behind him as quietly as I could. The woods around us grew darker as we got further into the trees. The air felt colder, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. We reached the edge of the clearing, where the trees were thick, and Ray stopped. I could see his eyes narrowing as he looked into the dark woods. I felt a drop of sweat roll down the side of my face, even though it was freezing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shape just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved. It was tall and thin, blending into the shadows. It looked like a person, but its movements were wrong. Too stiff, like it was trying too hard to stay hidden. It froze when it noticed us, then darted off into the darkness, too fast for a normal person. Ray didn't waste any time. He motioned for me to stay back, then rushed forward, silent as a ghost. His hand went to his pocket, and I realized he was reaching for a knife. I stood there, heart pounding, not knowing if I should follow or just run. I waited, my whole body on edge. Minutes felt like hours. Then I heard Ray's voice, low, sharp, but calm. He was calling for me to come over. I walked quickly, trying not to make a sound. When I reached him, I could see that his face was tight with worry. He didn't explain what had happened, just grabbed his gear and started packing up. We moved fast, too fast for comfort. We didn't say a word. I just followed him. The whole time we walked back to the truck, the air around us felt thick, almost charged. Every little noise in the woods seemed to echo. Every snap of a branch made my heart race. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. When we reached the truck, Ray's hands were shaking as he started the engine. His eyes flicked around, alert, like he was expecting something to jump out of the trees at any second. "I've been camping longer than I've been alive," he muttered quietly, staring straight ahead. But whatever that was, it wasn't right. I didn't argue. There was something in his voice that told me he wasn't just being paranoid. Something in the woods that night wasn't just a wild animal. It was something else. Something we couldn't understand. We didn't go back to the campsite. We didn't even talk about it on the drive home. But the whole time, I felt that strange weight in the air, the feeling that something was waiting, watching. We never spoke about it again. But when I look back on that night, I know one thing for sure. Whatever Ray and I saw in those woods wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal either. It was something else, something that didn't belong there. And I'm not sure we ever really got away from it. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. My grandfather and I decided to go camping by a quiet, far-off lake, where the trees went on forever and the only sounds were the wind and the occasional bird. The air was fresh, and I thought it would be a good chance to get away from everything. No cell phones, no noise, just us and the wilderness. We got there late in the afternoon, set up the tent, and started a small fire. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, everything went quiet. It wasn't like other times we'd camped. There were no other people around, no lights in the distance. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional splash from the lake. It felt too quiet, like the night was holding its breath. As the fire started to die down, I heard something strange. It was a soft sound, like something moving through the bushes near the camp. I looked around but saw nothing, just the trees, the shadows, and the dark lake. I tried to forget it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Grandpa had already gone into the tent to sleep, so I stayed outside for a little longer, staring up at the stars, trying to ignore the sense of being watched. Eventually, I crawled into the tent and zipped it up. The air inside felt thick, like the outside world was pressing in. I lay there, wide awake, staring up at the fabric above me. That's when I heard it again. Soft footsteps, moving slowly on the leaves and twigs outside. They weren't the usual sounds of animals. These steps were too heavy, too careful. I held my breath, listening hard. The footsteps circled the tent, moving around it like whatever it was taking its time, making sure I knew it was there. I reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking. I turned it on and aimed it at the wall of the tent. But there was nothing. No shadow, no sign of anyone. The footsteps stopped, suddenly, as if whoever was out there had just disappeared. I waited, my heart beating loudly in my chest. The silence felt too thick, too heavy. After what seemed like hours, I couldn't just lie there anymore. I slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to peek outside. The fire was still burning, but everything around it was dark. Too dark. There was no sound, no movement. My heart was racing as I stepped out of the tent, the cold air hitting my face. The woods felt more suffocating now. The silence was almost unbearable. I shined the flashlight around, its beam bouncing off the trees. I thought I saw something in the distance, but when I pointed the light toward it, there was nothing there. I walked around the camp, checking the area. There were no signs of animals, no broken branches, no tracks, nothing. Just the lake, the fire, and the dark trees. But something still didn't feel right. It was too quiet, too still. I went back into the tent, my hands still shaking. I kept the flashlight beside me, shining it on the ground, trying to stay calm. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, listening to every small noise around me. The footsteps didn't come back, but that strange feeling of something being wrong stayed with me. It wasn't until the first light of dawn, when the birds started to sing and the world slowly began to wake up, that I finally felt like I could breathe. In the morning, as we packed up to leave, I found something near the campfire. It was a footprint much too big to be from a bear, and definitely not from any animal I knew. It was a human print, but it wasn't like any I'd ever seen. It was fresh, pressed deep into the ground like someone had stood there for a long time, watching. Grandpa didn't notice. He was too busy packing up his gear, completely unaware of the tension that hung in the air. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, and it felt like they were closing in behind us, like something was hidden in there, watching, waiting. I didn't tell Grandpa about the footprint, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there that night, something that shouldn't have been. And as we drove further away, I couldn't help but feel like whatever had been lurking in the woods was still watching us, following us from the shadows. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the trees, but there was nothing. Still, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we weren't alone. Something had been there, and it had made sure we knew it. And even now, as I write this, I wonder if we were really ever meant to leave that place. I've been a cop for almost 10 years now, and I've seen a lot of things. Most people couldn't even imagine the stuff I've been through, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened last weekend when I decided to go camping alone in a forest out in the middle of nowhere. I've always liked being alone in nature, the quiet, with only the wind moving through the trees. There's something peaceful about it, something calming. I got to the spot I planned to camp at in the afternoon, with the sun still up and the air warm. It seemed like a perfect place to relax, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't shake. The trees were so close together, blocking the sky and making everything feel darker, even though it was still daytime. Maybe it was just me, overthinking it. After all, I'm a cop. I'm used to being on edge, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right here. I set up my camp, built a fire, and tried to relax after a long week. The sun went down and it started getting dark fast. As I sat there, the crackling of the fire was the only sound, but then I started hearing other things. The snap of twigs in the distance, the rustle of leaves. First, I brushed it off as normal forest noises. But then it happened again, closer this time, too close to my camp. My heart rate sped up. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. My senses were on high alert as I stepped away from the fire, shining the light out into the woods. That's when I saw it, a figure half hidden behind some bushes. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to get any closer, but I knew I had to check it out. Slowly, I moved toward the spot, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. When I pushed the bushes aside, I froze. Lying on the ground in front of me, face up in the dirt, was a man. His body was stiff and pale, his eyes wide open and staring at the sky like he'd been there for days. His clothes were torn, and the smell hit me instantly, a thick, rotten stench that made my stomach churn. But it wasn't just the smell that got to me. It was the way his body was lying there. His arms and legs were twisted at odd angles, like someone had dropped him there, not like he had fallen. I didn't call for help right away. Part of me didn't even want to believe what I was looking at. But I knew better. I stepped back, not taking my eyes off the body, my mind racing. I had to get out of there and report it. This wasn't something I could handle on my own. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Half buried in the dirt next to the body was something shiny. I knelt down and swept away the dirt. My flashlight hit a badge. It was crumpled and dirty, but I could still make out the faint outline of the name. My heart sank. It was the badge of a fellow cop. I didn't waste any time. I ran back to my truck as fast as I could. My mind was a mess, but something told me not to panic. I wasn't sure what I had gotten myself into, but I knew I had to stay calm. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. I called in what I found as soon as I had a signal. I couldn't explain everything to the dispatcher, but I knew one thing for sure. This was not just some random accident. This was something worse. I had to get the local cops out there, and fast. By the time they arrived, I was already back at the scene. We all went over the body together. It didn't take long to identify him. He was a former officer who had been reported missing a few weeks earlier. No one knew what had happened to him, but now it was clear he had been murdered. Signs of a struggle. Signs that he'd been ambushed out here, in the middle of nowhere. Whoever did this left him to die, alone and helpless. There were no witnesses, no clear clues to go on. It was a dead end. But one thing was clear. This wasn't a random killing. Someone killed him on purpose. Even after the police left, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than I had uncovered. I kept thinking about the forest. Felt like it was hiding something. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd found and what it all meant. The body was only the beginning. Felt like the forest itself knew things it wasn't supposed to know, things it was keeping secret, buried deep in the dirt, under the trees. I couldn't help but wonder if there were more bodies out there, more pieces of the story I hadn't discovered. Maybe there were more cops, more people who had disappeared. What else was out there in those trees, hidden away? I left the forest quickly after that. I packed up my gear and got out of there. The case went cold after a while, but I still think about that night. I still think about that man's eyes, staring into the sky, like he was waiting for someone or something. I don't know if he ever got a chance to see what was coming for him, but I wonder if it was something worse than just a quick death. And I'll never know what he saw before he died. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back to that forest. Not alone, anyway. Every time I drive past it, I can't help but feel like something's watching me. Something's waiting. That feeling, the one that told me something was wrong from the moment I stepped into those woods. It's still with me, and I know deep down I'll never escape it. Something is still out there. Something more than just the body. Something that's still out there, hidden in the shadows of the trees, waiting. It was a rainy night when I set up camp. I had my dog with me, Max, a big mutt who was always good company when I wanted to get away from everything. I'd been hiking all day, and I found a spot near a small creek to set up my tent. The rain started coming down harder, tapping on the tent, but it didn't bother me. Max, however, was acting a little weird. He kept staring at the trees, his ears up, growling softly. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind, but something didn't feel right. I settled in and had some trail mix while Max lay down next to me, still uneasy. It was one of those nights where the rain never seemed to stop, and everything outside felt distant and muffled. The fire had long gone out, and the only sound was the rain hitting the tent nonstop. Then I heard it. A rustling sound came from the woods. It wasn't like the usual noises from the wind or small animals. This was heavier, like something was moving on purpose. My heart started racing, and Max's growling got louder, more serious. I couldn't tell what it was, but the way the trees were moving made it feel like I wasn't alone anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a little, peeking outside into the dark. The light barely cut through the rain, but I saw nothing. Max was still stiff, staring at the trees, his eyes locked on the spot where the noise came from. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I zipped the tent back up and tried to calm Max down. He was still on edge, but I told myself it was probably just an animal. That didn't help with how nervous I felt, though. I pulled my sleeping bag over me, hoping I could fall asleep, but it didn't come. Every little sound, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. The rain kept coming down, but now it felt like it was trapping me inside, keeping me from thinking straight. Then it happened again. The rustling, closer this time, much closer. Max barked once, then twice, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't just some animal. The noise was too heavy, too planned. I had the sinking feeling that something was hunting me. I didn't know what to do. I was miles away from any road, and the rain had made everything so wet that I wouldn't be able to start a fire. I grabbed the flashlight again and slowly unzipped the tent. Max's growl was barely contained now, and the air felt thick with tension. I shined the flashlight into the trees, scanning the dark, wet woods, but there was nothing, just shadows and branches moving in the rain. Then I saw it. Just for a second, I thought I saw something. Tall, hunched, standing at the edge of the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I quickly aimed the flashlight in that direction. But it was gone. The rustling stopped. I froze, not daring to make a sound. Max had stopped growling, but he was still staring at the spot where I thought I saw something. We sat there in the dark, listening, waiting. The rain seemed to slow, and in that moment, I thought I heard footsteps. Quiet but real, moving away from my camp. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed Max's leash and packed up as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, but I had no choice. I couldn't stay there. Whatever had been in the woods was still out there, and I had no intention of finding out what it wanted. I didn't even bother trying to pack everything neatly. I just grabbed what I could, leaving most of the camping gear behind. We moved fast, Max pulling ahead like he knew exactly what to do. The rain helped cover our tracks, but I didn't feel safe until I reached the trailhead hours later. I saw a sign of civilization, and only then did I let out a breath. I was soaked, cold, and tired, but I never felt more relieved. But when I think back, I still don't know what that thing was in the woods. Whatever it was, I'll never go back to that spot again. Something was off that night. The feeling of being watched, the strange rustling, the way Max acted, it wasn't natural. What makes it worse is that every time I've gone camping since, I can't shake the thought that maybe it wasn't just one thing in the woods. Maybe it was waiting for me to make a mistake, to stay one more night so it could finally find out what I was really doing out there. I don't know if I'll ever find out, but I don't need to. Something was watching me that night, something that still remembers I was there. And every time I hear a branch snap or the wind picks up just a little too loudly, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting to see if I'll come back.